Hello and welcome to the second video of the Sheridan College online degree breadth elective course, Introduction to Medieval History. In this second video, we will be exploring the dying days of the Roman Empire, which faced threats of plague, invasion, economic depression, and internal strife. We'll also learn about the rise of a new religion, Christianity, which would transform the Roman Empire and eventually become its dominant religion. Finally, we'll take a look at the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the early Middle Ages. All that today in Lesson 2 of Introduction to Medieval History. The learning objectives of this lesson are: number 1, articulate the basic characteristics of the Roman Empire and its legacy. Number 2, understand the reasons for Christianity's rise and spread throughout the Roman world. And number 3, explain the causes and consequences of the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. You can't understand the Middle Ages without understanding what came before. The legacy of the Roman Empire is vast. They imparted their laws, their language, their customs and culture, which would shape the Western world for the next millennia. This is Rome at its height in the early 2nd century CE. It was a massive empire. In the south, it stretched from the sands of Tunisia in North Africa, in the north to the windswept highlands of Scotland. It covered most of continental Europe, Anatolia, and the Middle East, including the Holy Land. Some 3.5 million square miles, with perhaps as many as 50 million people living in it. This was one of the largest empires the ancient world would ever see. No matter where you went within the empire, you found towns, cities, and infrastructure identical to the rest. Each Roman town became a carbon copy of the others. Here you see an artist imagining the Roman city of Londinium, which we know today as London, England. Roman cities were islands that spread the Roman culture to the countryside. Whether you were in the far north of the empire in Londinium, or in a Roman African city like Carthage, you could expect to find a public bath with hot water, indoor plumbing, and steam rooms. You could take in entertainment at the local amphitheater, watch gladiators fight or animals. These are the well-preserved remains of a Roman amphitheater in Tunisia in North Africa. But at one time, similar buildings would have existed throughout the Roman Empire, including, of course, the Great Colosseum in the capital city of Rome, built in the 2nd century. At the outer fringes of the empire, Rome built defenses. Here you see the remains of Hadrian's Wall. Originally, it was 3 meters wide and 5 to 6 meters high. Today, the remains are obviously smaller, but the engineering feat is no less impressive. Stretching 73 miles across North Britain from coast to coast, Hadrian's Wall was built to guard the frontier of the Roman Empire. Outside the Roman Empire, many other peoples wanted in. Over time, many of those tribes, Germanic and Celts, became Romanized as they were conquered. The foundation of the Roman economy was a massive base of slaves. Slavery was an ever-present feature of the Roman world. As many as 1 in 3 of the population in Italy, or 1 in 5 across the empire, were slaves. And upon this foundation of forced labor was built the entire edifice of the Roman state and society. All of this was made possible, however, by the Roman army. The Roman army with its legions was arguably one of the longest surviving and most effective fighting forces in military history. One of the main reasons Rome became so powerful was because of the strength of its army. It was the backbone of Roman power. It was also the source of Rome's economic and political strength and a tool of cultural assimilation. Indeed, serving in the Roman army was a means by which foreigners could eventually become Roman citizens. But the process was not fast. Serving in the Roman army meant leaving one's home for decades. Soldiers were away from their families for long periods of time, which loosened their loyalties to their clans and replaced them with a loyalty to Rome. Only when a soldier had served in the army for 25 years could he hope to become a citizen of Rome. Another way the Romans controlled such a vast empire was with roads, and the Romans were great road builders. A vast network of Roman roads crisscrossed the empire, covering over 120,000 kilometers. Along these roads, armies, people, and goods moved across the empire. In fact, many of the old Roman roads underlie the modern network of highways which connect Europe and the Middle East today. Perhaps the most obvious legacy of the Romans is their language. The Romans spoke Latin. Their alphabet looks very familiar to us. Indeed, it is our alphabet today. This inscription is nearly 2,000 years old, and yet I bet you can read the letters just fine. In fact, it's really just the Times New Roman font you probably use in your essays. Across the top it reads, Senatus Populusque Romanos, the Senate and People of Rome, which was a sort of slogan of sorts for Rome, and it was frequently abbreviated as SPQR. Wherever the Romans conquered, they brought their language. It quickly established itself as the language of business and government. If you wanted to do business with Rome, you needed to do it in Latin. If you wanted to live in the Roman Empire, you needed to speak Latin. Over time, the languages of the conquered slowly disappeared. Originally, much of the mainland Europe was dominated by the Celtic culture and languages. Over time, however, the Celtic languages all but disappeared to be replaced by Latin. Only on the edges of the empire, in what is modern-day Ireland and Scotland, would Celtic remain in the form of Gaelic and Irish. When the Roman Empire eventually disappeared, its language, Latin, remained. Over time, the Latin that was spoken in the area of Italy began to be different than the Latin spoken in what would one day be France, and what was spoken in what will one day be Spain and Portugal. Latin would eventually change into what we call the Romance languages today. Languages such as French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are all modern versions of Latin, a living legacy to the long disappeared Roman Empire. Today, over 1 billion people on the planet speak a modern form of Latin. Everywhere you see on this map, which is orange or yellow, is where a Romance language is an official language or a national secondary language. Now, you might be wondering why we actually call the Romance languages Romance languages. And it's not because they are more romantic than other languages. In the Middle Ages, around the 12th century, a particular form of writing became popular in the courts of Europe. They were tales written about chivalry and love, about handsome and brave knights and beautiful princesses. The tales about an imaginary King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table are all part of this genre. The stories were called romances. But the reason for that, however, has nothing to do with love. These stories were written in an early form of the French language, which, as it was a living form of Latin, people simply referred to it as the Romans language. Tell us another tale in the Romans language, they might say. This was the spoken everyday French which people conversed in. Since these stories were about love, the association with romance and love was cemented, thus the word romance today. We can also see the legacy of the Latin language in how modern languages have changed. In fact, we can hear the echoes of the Romans in our very speech. Latin was originally pronounced very differently compared to how its descendants, the Romance languages, are pronounced today. In Latin, the letter C was pronounced hard, almost like a K. Thus, the great Roman leader Caesar would have actually been pronounced more like Kaiser. Moreover, J's were pronounced as Y's. So to pronounce his name the way he would have said it, you wouldn't have called him Julius Caesar, you would have called him Julius Caesar. After Caesar died, future Roman emperors took on his name as a title of sorts. Thus, all Roman emperors were referred to as Caesar. Eventually, over the past 2,000 years, the C in Romance languages began to soften. So slowly, the Old Latin pronunciation Kaiser becomes Caesar. However, the memory of how the name was pronounced is remembered in the names of kings. In Germany, when Germany had a king, he was referred to as a Kaiser. And in Russia, the king was called the Tsar. Both of these are simply adaptations of the Roman title for leader, Kaiser. When Caesar sent a letter to the Roman Senate around 47 BCE, after he had achieved a quick victory in battle, he wrote just 3 Latin words, which are often reproduced today. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But if we're pronouncing it the way he would have, then we should actually say veni, vidi, vici. The letter V in classical Latin was pronounced like a W. We can see the legacy of this in the word for wine. For example, the Latin word for wine was vinum. However, gradually over time in Latin's descendants, the V started to be pronounced the way we pronounce V's. So the word for wine in French is vin. In Spanish and Italian, it's vino. When the ancient Germanic tribes first encountered the Romans, they had no word for wine. They were northern peoples, beer drinkers. So they adopted the Roman word for the new alcoholic beverage, and they pronounced it just like the Romans did, with a W sound. So in English today, which is a Germanic language, we say wine, and in German, it's Wein. The ancient Latin is preserved in us, in our speech. Another important legacy of the Roman Empire today is law. The Romans were great lawmakers. Over the period of the Roman Empire, the Romans codified a set of laws which would eventually become the basis for much of the world's law systems today. Referred to as Roman civil law, the code set down the basic rules of property and legal procedures. The law codes are the basis of the laws in France, Italy, Spain, and many other places. In English-speaking lands, a different type of law code became the norm, inherited from the Anglo-Saxons. Our laws are based on the English common law. This ancient code, along with the Roman law codes, provides the backbone for nearly every legal system today. In this map, you can see the distribution of legal systems around the world. Most of the world follows the Roman code, while places where the British Empire touched, you can see English common law predominant. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. How did the Roman Empire come to be? How did they come to have such a profound influence on the modern world today? Rome began as a small settlement on the Tiber River, midway up the Italian peninsula on the Mediterranean, sometime around the 8th century BCE. It started as a kingdom, growing and eventually conquering the entirety of the Italian peninsula. As Rome grew, it eventually revolted against their kings and established the world's first republic, a type of representative democracy ruled by an aristocratic elite. By the beginning of the 1st century CE, the Roman Republic emerged from a brutal civil war as an empire ruled by its first emperor, Augustus. For approximately 200 years, Rome entered into a period of peace and stability under the leadership of successive Roman emperors. It is sometimes referred to as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. During the Pax Romana, the empire reached the height of its power and size. Long-distance trade flourished, Rome's legions protected her borders, and a vast network of roads stretched from one end of the empire to the other. However, over time the Roman Empire began to struggle. By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome's vast empire had become increasingly difficult to control. The crisis of the 3rd century was a period of approximately 50 years, during which the Roman Empire nearly collapsed in the face of civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic depression. During this time, Rome would see a series of 20 different emperors and near constant civil war. At the same time, a series of plagues spread through the population, and we don't know exactly what these plagues were. Some have suggested measles or smallpox, but we do know that the effects were devastating. The Antonine Plague that preceded the crisis of the 3rd century sapped manpower from the Roman armies and proved disastrous for the Roman economy. Then, from 249 CE to 262 CE, the Cyprian Plague devastated the Roman Empire so much that some cities, such as the city of Alexandria in Egypt, experienced a 62% decline in population. At the same time, Rome entered into a great financial depression. Since the days of the Pax Romana, Rome's economy depended on trade. When Rome was at peace, it was relatively easy and safe for merchants to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks. Civil unrest and war during the crisis made it hazardous for merchants to travel. Rampant inflation made things worse. With a vacuum of power in the center of Rome, rebellions in the provinces and invasions at the borders became commonplace. Tribes such as the Franks penetrated along the Rhine River, and Goths threatened the Danube. And the Saxons invaded Britain. In the east, the Sassanids became more aggressive, and suddenly Rome was in a very precarious position. It should be noted that for most of these tribes, their main goal was to simply find land to farm in. They didn't seek the destruction of the empire, they simply wanted in. As a result, the frontiers of Rome experienced almost incessant raids. Rome would eventually settle down, finally under the rule of Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian's reign stabilized the empire and marks the end of the crisis of the 3rd century. His innovation was that he realized that the empire had become too big for any one person to rule alone. He decided to divide the empire into 4 major territories. 4 regions and 4 rulers replaced the rule of one man. The rest of the history of the Roman Empire, Rome would frequently have multiple emperors ruling over different parts of the empire. However, civil war between different emperors became a common feature of Roman history as well. It was against this backdrop that Rome also experienced massive change with respect to religion. Traditionally, Rome had been very accommodating to other religions. The Romans, like most ancient peoples, believed in many gods. They were polytheistic, and as such, they had no problem with these gods coexisting with the gods of other peoples in a sort of a massive pantheon. Many foreign religions began to spread throughout the empire. Mystery cults such as the Egyptian cult of Isis, the Greek cult of Dionysus, or the Eastern cult of Cybele all achieved high popularity within Rome. However, the one religion which was quite a bit different for the Romans was Judaism. The Jews, you see, were monotheistic, that is, they believed in one God. Initially, the Jews in the Roman Empire were mostly left at peace to practice their religion. However, a Jewish rebellion in 66 CE, which the Romans brutally suppressed, made the situation more uneasy. Christianity would prove to be even more difficult for the Romans. Christianity begins as a Jewish sect. It begins with a man named Jesus of Nazareth, who most likely lived at the beginning of the first millennium and who was almost certainly a Jew himself. Jesus had become popular against a backdrop of numerous Jewish end-time groups, that is, groups that believed that the end of the world was close at hand and that the prophesied Jewish savior would soon come to earth. Jesus himself may have been an end-time preacher or an apocalyptic prophet proclaiming that the kingdom of God was imminent. After achieving some fame and many followers, he was arrested by the Romans and crucified sometime around 26 to 36 CE, perhaps for stirring up crowds at the festival of Passover. Crucifixion was the Roman penalty for rebels and traitors. Shortly after his death, his disciples claimed that he had risen from the dead and that he had then ascended to heaven, and that they now had a new mission to spread what they called the good news, the gospel, that the kingdom of God would arrive soon. Christianity spread slowly at first, and initially only amongst Jewish populations. However, it was not long before they came under the notice of the Romans. In 64 CE, a great fire devastated Rome and destroyed much of the city. For reasons unknown, the Emperor Nero decided to make Christians the scapegoat. Rumors had abounded that Nero himself had been responsible for the fire, and he had certainly taken advantage of the resulting devastation of the city by building a new lavish private palace on one part of the site of the fire. So perhaps to divert attention from these rumors, Nero ordered that Christians should be rounded up and killed. Some were torn apart by dogs, others burnt alive as human torches. Over the next 100 years or so, Christians were sporadically persecuted by the Romans. Sometimes Christians even faced almost theatrical punishments alongside criminals. Damnatio ad bestias, which is Latin for condemnation to the beasts, was a form of Roman capital punishment in which the condemned person was killed by wild animals, usually lions or other big cats. This form of execution, which first came to ancient Rome around the 2nd century BCE, was part of a wider class of blood sports called bestiarii. While the followers of Jesus were initially drawn from the Jewish population of the empire, eventually the religion began to spread in the rest of the Roman population. Pockets of Christian communities sprung up throughout the empire, mostly in the east and along the Mediterranean. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had even begun to spread into the upper echelons of Roman society. And here, Christianity would eventually find its greatest patron in the form of the Emperor of Rome himself. The Emperor Constantine, sometimes known as Constantine the Great, would change the fortunes of Christians completely. Constantine was born sometime in the later 280s CE. He was the son of a Roman emperor in the West. Probably most important for Constantine's subsequent life, his mother Helena happened to be a devout Christian. Now, Constantine himself was pagan, and he had been raised to sacrifice to the old Roman gods, but his mother's influence on his later life is indisputable. Later, as an adult, he became one of the 4 emperors of the Roman Empire. However, he spent much of his early reign embroiled in a civil war. It was during this civil war that a fateful moment in the history of Christianity and Constantine's life occurred. The Battle of Milvian Bridge took place in 312 CE. It takes its name from the Milvian Bridge, which was an important route over the Tiber River. According to legend, on the eve of this battle, Constantine had a vision. A voice said to him on high, "In hoc signo vinces," which means, "In this sign you will conquer." The sign, according to legend, was a Christian symbol. He ordered that this symbol be painted on the shields of his army, and the next morning, Constantine won the battle. Many would credit Christianity for his victory. The following year, Constantine, along with his co-emperor, signed the Edict of Milan. This edict allowed religious freedom throughout the empire and officially legalized Christianity. In the years that followed, Constantine defeated the last of his fellow emperors, and in 324 CE, he became the first sole emperor to rule the empire, the entire Roman Empire, east and west, since Diocletian. A sense of stability returned to the empire. Constantine, however, wanted to make an even cleaner break from the past. He decided to build a new capital city to replace Rome in 330 CE. For his location, he chose the small city of Byzantium. Being a humble man, he named his city after himself, Constantinople. Constantinople strategically was located on the European side of the Strait of Bosphorus, so it could control traffic to and from the Black Sea and thus traffic from east and west, thus from Asia to Europe. The move of the capital from west to east would have profound implications, not just for the future of the Roman Empire, but really for the Western world itself. The city of Constantinople would remain a shining beacon of civilization for centuries and would continue to be important even after it was renamed Istanbul by the Ottomans hundreds of years in the future. Christianity during the time of Constantine was still a religion in flux. There were many different competing Christian sects and various beliefs. By the 4th century, the basic structure of the Christian Bible had appeared, with its Old Testament based on Jewish texts and its New Testament with stories about the life of Jesus. A clearer hierarchy of the Christian church began to appear. At the top were bishops, usually one bishop per city. They were in charge of all the Christians in a particular region. Beneath bishops were priests, who tended to the day-to-day needs of the Christian population, baptizing babies, running church services, etc. However, a new branch of the church also emerged, which we call monasticism. This was the monks and the nuns. Monks and nuns were men and women who wanted to dedicate their lives to quiet study and prayer. Believing that only through isolation they could be closer to God, they took strict vows of celibacy and lived together in convents, cut off from the outside world. However, as Christianity continued to flourish, the days of the Roman Empire were numbered. About 100 years after Constantine, the Roman Empire was nearly at its end. The fall of the Roman Empire was not something which happened overnight. Gradually, the empire found it more and more difficult to maintain control over such a vast region. In 410 CE, for the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome itself was captured and ransacked by an invading army. The empire was forced to abandon Britain on the frontier and bring the troops home. While Rome itself recovered from the ransacking in 410, Roman Britons were forced to defend themselves against invading Germanic tribes such as the Angles and the Saxons. Over time, these tribes succeeded and established new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms where Roman and Celtic cities once stood. On September 4th, 476 CE, faced with an advancing army led by the Germanic leader Odoacer, the last Western Roman emperor, Flavius Romulus Augustus, abdicated the throne of the Western Roman Empire. He was just 16 years old. By convention, his abdication marked the end of the Roman Empire. But really, things didn't change that much immediately on the morning after September 476. Life would change very, very slowly. In fact, in one important way, the Roman Empire didn't actually fall at all. Just part of it did. The western provinces did fall away, but in the east, the empire remained intact. Centered in its glittering capital city, Constantinople, the Romans continued for centuries more. However, the eastern half of the Roman Empire was always a little different from the west. For one thing, the most common everyday language was Greek, not Latin. Culturally, over time, it became more and more different from the old Roman Empire. After the year 500, historians generally refer to it as the Byzantine Empire to distinguish it from the old Roman Empire. But you should note that the Byzantines continued to call themselves the Romans right up until the end. In the West, however, the Roman Empire was done. In its place, new kingdoms arose, controlled by different Germanic tribes: the Visigothic kingdom, the Ostrogoths, and the Franks. In our next lecture video, we'll look more closely at what came next. We'll look at the inheritors of the Roman Empire, the European kingdoms, the Byzantine Empire, and the birth of another new religion, Islam, which in just a couple hundred years would rival Christianity in size and influence. All that next week on Introduction to Medieval History.